Hey, Larken Rose here, and it's time for the lovely Amanda to give another dramatic reading of a small piece of the Jones Plantation novel, after which I'll give some commentary on the topic. Yeehaw.
Again, more words of wisdom from Mr. Smith. If a man knows that he is being robbed and abused, he resists. But if he can be made to believe that he is freely choosing to nobly sacrifice his own property and his own freedom for the sake of his family, for the benefit of his community or his country, then he will take pride in his own compliance and obedience, even when he has no choice. Essentially, you're using their virtue against them. If a man thinks of himself as caring and generous, and you tell him that you need to inflict certain deprivations and suffering upon him personally in order to serve and benefit the group as a whole, what are his options? If he cooperates, then he can brag about the mistreatment he tolerates, as if it is a badge of honor and an indication of how caring he is. But if instead he in any way resists or objects to being robbed and mistreated, then he can be condemned for being selfish and for not caring enough about others.
So it's important for people to understand that tyrannical psychos use people's virtues against them, just like Mr. Smith said. Like he said, because I wrote him to say that. And a fine example of that is the last few years and the COVID debacle, catastrophe, ridiculous conspiracy, which it absolutely was. Notice that they didn't just say, hey, everybody, like, give a bunch of money to Big Pharma. The people going along with it, the people wearing masks and standing 6 feet apart and shutting down their business, most of them felt virtuous and superior and compassionate and responsible for going along with it, because the control freaks didn't just say, do this because we want you to. They said, do this, first of all, for your own health. So first of all, be scared, because bad things are going to happen if you don't give us lots of money and give us lots of power and do whatever we say. But also, bad things are going to happen to other people. The guilt trip of, unless you want to kill grandma, you're going to do all these things. So there's a fundamental difference between being upset that people were gullible enough to fall for that crap, which they were, a huge number of people were, and the idea that people will just do anything that authority says, because a lot of people won't, including a lot of people who will mindlessly follow along with stupid mandates and dictates because they don't know how to think enough to question anything, so they defer to people in positions of authority. And when Fauci gets out there and says, this is what we have to do for public health, they go, I guess this is what we have to do for public health. And they're too dumb to question it. Too dumb to question it is a different thing than so just amoral and mindless that they will knowingly harm their neighbors. Because if government came out and said, you have to do this thing which is going to hurt your neighbors, none of them would have done it. Nobody would have gone along with that. Now, the reality is that's what they did. The shutdowns were horribly destructive of millions of people's jobs. The mask mandates, the shutdowns, a bunch of stuff were just horribly traumatic on children. So you had grown-ups traumatizing the hell out of children, thinking they were doing the right thing. So there's part of this that absolutely should be condemned, but we need to understand the different categories of blind obedience. People who put masks on kids, you were just torturing kids for no reason at all. Like, even what your own lying scumbag experts said showed that it was no danger to children at any point. People with children with normal immune systems were perfectly fine. They should just get it and get it over with. I think even Fauci early on was saying that before he figured out, hey, if you make people wear these masks, it'll remind everybody to be scared, and then they'll all run off and get jabbed, which will make, tens of billions of dollars for Big Pharma. So they completely shifted their position on that. So it isn't that people won't do evil things. It's people won't do things that they recognize as evil. But they will absolutely do destructive evil things if they can be duped by the worst people in the world into thinking that their actions are actually compassionate and helpful and being on the safe side, and it's for health and safety. And no, it isn't at all. But there's so there's plenty to be worried about. We have this huge example of a huge number of people went along and tortured children, literally tortured their own children, because they were too ignorant and intellectually lazy to even doubt something long enough. Now, for a grown-up, they may go, I don't know if the masks do anything, but I mean, it's a minor inconvenience, and I don't want somebody at the store to whine at me, so I'm going to put it on. Okay, I can sympathize with that. People who don't know any better, they have no idea whether it works or not. They're just going to do it because to them it's not that big an inconvenience. That's one level of, okay, you're willingly inflicting something on yourself to just sort of, avoid conflict. And there are even times when I might even criticize people for that, but, it's pretty low level, act of immorality to inconvenience yourself a little bit. Okay? You have the right to do that. But when people put it on their kids and the kids are having trouble breathing and they're crying and all that, and the parent still doesn't check, that's pretty freaking creepy. Like if your own child is obviously suffering and you keep basically torturing your own child because some talking head on TV that works for government told you to, I'm having a hard time not saying that you're a shit parent, because you're a shit parent if you torture your child based on word of mouth of some stranger you don't know, because you don't just defer to authority for what you put up with or what you put yourself through. Now you're inflicting that on little children who have no choice in the matter. That's pretty scumbaggish. And so I think that the grown-ups who did that, and teachers did it, and parents did it, that's a special level of condemnation that you absolutely deserve. You weren't just doing it to yourself. You were torturing little children with something that provably didn't do any good. Be perfectly clear about that. You tortured little children and made them do something which provably did no good at all. You tortured them and accomplished nothing positive. It's not like, well, you have to wear that uncomfortable seatbelt because maybe the car will crash and you might die if you're not wearing a seatbelt. It wasn't a trade-off. You inflicted horrible suffering on them in trade for absolutely fucking nothing, because the masks did absolutely nothing to protect anybody. Now, some of us bothered to read the old data and studies, and we already knew that, and we were saying that the whole time, and you didn't listen while you were torturing children. Then later, the Cochrane study came out, the meta-study, looking at a whole bunch of other studies and going, yeah, masks don't do any good. And you were trying to protect the children from something that all of the experts you were bowing to said statistically poses no threat to their lives anyway. And there's zero chance we're going to isolate them away from this permanently. Sooner or later, they're going to come in contact with it, and it's not going to kill them anyway, and you tortured kids anyway. That deserves condemnation. So, I'm not saying the people who went along with it because they were scared are blameless. They're not, especially if they inflicted it on other people. Especially, like where we shop, I still will not go to Sprouts ever again, because some of the biggest mask Nazis were there doing completely irrational things that don't even fit with their own idiotic fear-mongering in a store that pretends to be about health. Really? And yes, it's California owned by a bunch of left-leaning collectivists who demonstrated that they don't actually give a shit about health. Their loyalty to their political leanings matter 1,000 times more than the health of their customers. So we're never going back there. An example is Amanda literally shopped there without a mask, made it all the way to the checkout thing. She was there, self-checkout, nobody there. She's like 10 feet from the door. And some busybody collectivist liberal dumbass came over and grabbed all her stuff. First of all, got in her face. Like, if you think she's this disease-carrying plague, Why did you approach her when nobody was there, grabbed all her stuff and took it back? Because you're not wearing a mask. Okay, you're an idiot and you're a power-happy piece of crap. And so I'm never going back to that Sprouts. And so there are people who take the opportunity to be on a power trip. And when people inflict it on other people, and gee whiz, of all the people who were loudly, proudly, chastising other people for not wearing a mask that doesn't any good, how many of them have apologized? I've seen, I think, 3 so far, people who actually had the self-awareness and the honesty and the integrity to publicly post a thing that said, I went along, I didn't really know what was happening, I didn't research anything, I took their word for it, and then I bashed people who didn't, and now in retrospect I recognize it was stupid. I've seen, I think, 3 whole people do that. One was actually a famous actor, I forget his name, who came out and admitted, yeah, I was bashing people for not getting stabbed, and I shouldn't have done that, that was really bad. And another was some random guy, I just saw a video recently. The vast majority of people who went on a power trip against other people based on that, doing the whole virtue signaling, we're mindlessly going along with whatever a bunch of bureaucrats said, why aren't you? So there's a whole spectrum of how much somebody is a slimeball from they just inflicted it on themselves because they didn't know any better and whatever, they just sort of went along to get along and they weren't inflicting it on other people. Okay, that person, I can totally relate and sympathize, and I don't have to be mad at that person. Like, yeah, you put yourself through some crap you didn't really need to, and it didn't do any good, but, I mean, you can decide whether to put yourself through some crap. The grown-ups who inflicted it on children with no good reason whatsoever, yeah, I'm having a hard time not saying, you suck. You tortured children because somebody told you to, and there was no scientific basis for it. It didn't do any good. It wasn't a trade-off. You just tortured children because lying bureaucrats told you to. That's the end. And if you can admit that and acknowledge that, you're an even bigger scumbag. Because it means ultimately you care more about your reputation and what you look like in your virtue signaling than you do about children. So yes, I will absolutely guilt trip you with that. The same way Fauci and those lying scumbags tried to guilt trip everybody else who didn't go along with their ridiculous fear-mongering. But to tie this in again with the Mr. Smith quote that Amanda just read, very often, if you look at the whole spectrum of how much people were collaborating with evil and how much they had a reason to know it, most people who went along with it thought they were doing the right thing. It was actually their virtue, which is why they're there saying, like, it's just 2 weeks to flatten the curve. And never mind that everybody just forgot what that meant. Like, I've explained this before. This curve, we want to flatten it. Guess what? For those who flunked basic algebra and math, the area under both curves was the same, which means everyone's going to be exposed to it anyway. There's nothing we've ever been able to do in the history of humanity to stop that from happening. We just want to slow the rate at which absolutely everybody is going to be exposed to this so we don't overwhelm the hospitals. That was the initial excuse. And that was a claim that, okay, if people fell for that and thought that was the thing, that actually makes sense. It wasn't true, but it's a thing people can believe. But after that, when the story suddenly changed, like, what happened to the 14 days? We're up to a year now, and you're still pushing this crap. You admitted before this isn't stopping anything. There isn't such a thing as make the curve disappear. So what are we doing? And so using people's virtue against them is one thing, like Mr. Smith talked about in that quote. But the more demented thing is using people's virtue and then their own self-image to get them to eventually be the nasty people attacking the people who don't obey and who don't just blindly believe and who don't go along with it. So there's a big distinction to me between the people who just like subjected themselves to a bunch of pointless crap because, well, I don't know any better. I guess I'll do what they say and inflict that on myself. And the people who eagerly and zealously inflicted it on other people and could do it in the name of, I care more. No, you're just a power-happy piece of shit who wanted an excuse to abuse other people. And to me, that's a very good parallel with people who are like in law enforcement. Some people join law enforcement thinking, I'm going to stop the bad guys and protect the good guys. Cool, that's a noble intention. Now, you're not going to do that by way of being a government law enforcer, because it's your job as a law enforcer to violently impose the will of the politicians onto everybody by way of every stupid, arbitrary bullshit command that they call law, which is not just protecting the innocent. It is victimizing the innocent in the name of politician scribbles. But you can get some people who are trying to do good things by way of being law enforcement, and you get other people who are on a power trip, but their supposed, and you can see this in a million videos, their supposed authority makes them talk down to other people. Why are you giving me attitude? Why aren't you going along with it? Why aren't you groveling and kissing the ring? I'm the righteous one bossing you around, and you, at all resisting or questioning anything in any way, makes you the bad guy. Do you have something to hide? Why aren't you letting me randomly rummage through all your stuff and your house? You must have something to hide. No, you must be a power-tripping piece of shit who uses as an authority as an excuse to live out his control freak megalomania. So there's that whole spectrum of how much somebody is personally malicious and how much they're just stupidly going along with something because they don't know any better. Most people were just stupidly going along with something because they don't know any better. And there are ways to measure that. Like in Arizona, when the mask mandates fell apart, or the big companies said, we're not going to enforce that anymore. We're going to tell people, can you wear a mask? And if they walk in, we're going to let them shop anyway without one. And the moment they said that, a huge percentage of people around here, around Phoenix, suddenly you see a ton of people in Home Depot and Walmart and stuff without masks. Because they're like, okay, if you're not going to make me, that demonstrates that those people were just going along to not get nagged at. They didn't believe the BS. They didn't fall for the fear-mongering. They weren't like doing it because it's going to save grandma. They knew that was crap from the beginning, but they were going along to be nice. And that's sort of deserving of a little bit of praise, kind of. I'm trying pretty hard to be nice to them. Like you're trying to get along. You're compromising and doing this dumb thing, inflicting it on yourself to try to get along. Even that is a clever trick by the worst people in the world. Because they know full well, like they're watching the game and seeing how it's playing out and realizing most people, most decent people, they don't want conflict. They don't want to be getting into arguments with everybody. And a lot of them would rather inconvenience themselves and put themselves through stupid crap that they know they shouldn't have to go through just for the sake of avoiding having to have a screaming match with somebody else. And so you could see when the rules change, you could see the number of people that were just going along to try to avoid trouble and conflict. But they still went along with authoritarian BS, and they still helped to empower the agenda by way of their virtue. And that's what tyrants do, is find ways to get the good people and manipulate their goodness so that they go along with the agenda. And then the nasty power-happy people find a way that their power happiness can come out where they're enforcing the agenda, whether they're law enforcers or somebody at Sprouts having a tantrum at somebody for not wearing a mask. The people who are a power trip waiting to happen. And so the tyrants, if they just aimed at genuinely nasty people and said, well, we're going to do this agenda and we're just going to find nasty people who like to boss their neighbors around, they would never accomplish anything because most people think of themselves as the good guy. They think they're virtuous. They think they're doing the right thing. And so the tyrants have to do the manipulative game of making people feel virtuous. And so in the Mr. Smith example that she read, a lot of people, this is becoming less true, but a lot of people pay their taxes proudly and they think, I'm paying my fair share of the costs of society. No, you're not. You're enriching and empowering the worst people in the world. So they can like blow up little children on the other side of the world and have Ponzi schemes and buy people's loyalties and destroy people's lives and be parasitic psychos in every way they can think of. That's what you're actually funding. But if people can be tricked into, I'm paying my taxes to help society, they can be proud of being robbed by a parasitic ruling class. And that makes way more people go along with it. And you can actually see that. I just saw in some random post that there was, when I was scrolling through the feed on Facebook, of somebody pointing out taxation is theft. And other people going, except it pays for this, and you should be proud to blah, blah, blah. Wow, watch these people righteously defending their own extortion and subjugation, making excuses for it, taking pride in being victimized. And so it was interesting that I just saw a real world example of people doing exactly what Mr. Smith in that little passage described, of tyrants tricking people into taking pride in being victimized. Because the tyrants don't just say, do what I say because I'll hurt you if I don't. Do what I say because you care about your community and your country, and we're here to help families and middle class, blah, 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 blah. Give us more money, give us more power if you care about grandma or the children or middle class workers or whatever bullshit we're pretending we support today, which is really just power for the ruling class. But the fact that they have to put it in those terms is actually a good sign, because it means people won't go along, most people won't go along with something if they recognize it as destructive and evil. The sad thing is most people are pretty damn easy to trick into not understanding what's actually happening, and so they'll go along with something that is destructive and evil while thinking they're the good guys, while virtue signaling about it. And proudly bragging, look, I got stabbed with a thing I don't understand that isn't even a vaccine, but look how virtuous I am, everybody. I'm protecting grandma. No, you're enriching Big Pharma and empowering a bunch of psychopaths who used your good intentions and your ignorance to dupe you into being a pawn for the worst people in the world. Just like Mr. Smith explained. Yeah.
To get your copy of the Jones Plantation novel, you can go to thejonesplantation.com. And if you haven't yet seen the movie, what the heck is wrong with you? jonesplantationfilm.com. Yeehaw.